In this video, we will learn how to implement authentication from scratch in Nestjs, the Node.js framework. We are going to learn how to create user and store hashed password. We are also going to see how to validate the user login credentials and issue JWT token. Also, we are going to see how to validate this JWT token and how to safeguard application routes. These and more are the things we are going to cover in this lesson. So this is going to touch on a number of things, including guards and decorators. To get started, let me go ahead and create new Nestjs project using the CLI. Nest new, let me call this my Auth app. Use npm and wait for the installation to complete. Now I will go into the project, my Auth app. Let me go ahead and create two modules, one for users, the other one for Auth, that is for authentication, because we are going to authenticate user in this application. So I'm going to use the Nest CLI and say Nest generate resources users using REST API. Give me the CRUD. This is going to create some of the common files like the controller class file, the service class, etc. for users. I will do something similar for Auth for authentication related codes. In the code, I added some VS Code settings. This is not really part of our authentication stuff, but things that just for example, to automatically reformat files when I save, to organize import and things like that. That is for settings.json. Then this is for when I click this button to debug. This is the configuration that will help me for that. Just something for you to take note of when you should download this code. The next thing I want to do now is to go to app module and do some database related configuration. Type ORM is a popular ORM when working with Nestjs, when working in Nestjs project, and that's what we are going to make use of. To do that, I'm going to first install the packages, but I'm not going to use MySQL. So this is type ORM dependencies, and this is if you are going to use MySQL. There's also Postgres, etc. I'm going to use SQLite database, so that if you happen to clone this project later, you don't need any extra setup to run it. Let me go ahead and install this, but instead of MySQL there, I'm going to use SQLite 3. Next, I'm going to import and configure type ORM here. So I'm not going to type out every single character of the code to save us some time, but what I'm doing here is to import and configure type ORM. By the way, the VS Code settings I did, you can see that when I save this file, it auto formats. That's one of the reasons for that settings file. I'll go ahead and import type ORM from type ORM and import user from user entity file. So this is saying that the type of database I'm going to use is type ORM is SQLite, and this is the name I've chosen to give the database. You can call it whatever you want, and the entities, where to locate the entity files, that's what this is for. And this is because I'm just doing a demo here. So this is going to, whatever change I make in the entity files is going to reflect in the database. So it is not something you want to do in production. In production, you can use things like migrations or stuff like that. One thing I want to do now, so I don't forget, is to git ignore my database. Although there's nothing really secret that is going to be stored there, but let me just git ignore this guy. So SQ like 3. And that should be it for this configuration. Next, I will go to users entity file to define the columns I want to have in the table, in the database. Again, I'm not going to type out every single thing, but I'm going to explain. So for this to be recognized as an entity file, we mark it with this @entity decorator. Then in the table, I'm going to have ID, which is a primary key auto-generated value column. And I'm going to have username that is going to be unique, and password and name, which is optional, and account status, just whatever you want to have. This is not really that important. By the way, I think these are the only two we are going to use for authentication. Now I will go to users service. First, in the constructor, I want to inject type ORM repository for user entity. So this lesson, of course, before you get to the point of implementing authentication, it is assumed that you already know the basic stuff like this. Next, let's have the method for creating user. And this is where we are going to hash password before storing it in the database. Let me go ahead and import this create user DTO, and I will define these fields in the DTO because right now it is empty. I'll go ahead and specify the fields, not like this. I just want to, this validator is not really necessary, but since I already have it here, I'm going to install some packages for validation in a moment. So I just want to, for creating user, I want to have username as required field and password as required field. Name is optional because in our entity file, we say that this guy is nullable, the name. So this is for create user DTO. Let me go ahead and take care of this package for validation. And for that, let's look at what I need to install. I'm just going to install class validator and class transformer for informing the type for the validation. With that, the error should go away for the import statement here. Back to the user service, I still have an error, and that is related to bcrypt because we have not installed it. Let's install and import bcrypt to make the error go away. So I'm going to say npm install bcrypt.js. Actually, that's the one I need. Then in the code, I'm going to import bcrypt.js. So what is happening here is we just grab items from the DTO object, and first we generate a salt that makes the password more difficult to crack. And here we use bcrypt to hash the password because we don't want to save the plain text password in the database. Instead, we want to hash it before we save it. Finally, we save those information in the database. And here, before returning the newly created user, I want to delete the password field. I mentioned before, I think, that this is going to exclude password field from being selected. But as the name implies, select. That means when you run a select query, in this case that we just save, it is not going to remove the password field. That's why I'm deleting it here. Next, I'm going to add two methods specifically for selecting. It's not really that important. Okay, we are going to use this when we want to handle authentication. I will explain this in a moment. This is just going to return the list of users. Here I'm just selecting all users. I want to use it to show you the selecting I was trying to explain here. And then this other one, because by default we have said that password should not be selected, so I want to explicitly specify that whether password should be selected or not when I call this method, because we need to select password when we want to check that the user credentials are valid. Let me go ahead and create this find users DTO. Just going to export class. I'm not really going to do any search and filter, but let me leave this thing like this. So find users DTO. To make this warning here, because I didn't use DTO, I'm getting that error there. To make it go away, I'll come here and change it to 1 instead of error. So when I have something that I didn't use, it should just warn me not to cause error. Before we move further, let me go ahead and update this users module setup. So here I am importing the type ORM module for user entity, and I'm also exporting user service because we are going to use it in the other module, in the Auth module. Before we come back to users module, let's pause and focus on Auth module for a little while. So I'm going to first delete this create auth update auth. Doesn't sound right. Instead, I'm going to have a login DTO class, and in this file what I want is this. During login, the user is required to supply username and password. In Auth service, let me delete the auto-generated code and have this instead. I'm going to explain every part of the code, and we are going to install the missing package. For now, this Nestjs JWT. Let me go ahead and install that before we continue. npm install the package. While that is installing, so here are just basic stuff. Inject the user service and JWT service. That means that the Auth module has to import the users module. So import, in the import array you say users module. Back to the service class. I have only two methods here. One is validate user, the other one is login. What does this validate user do? It basically takes the username and password and check against what is in the database to know whether the username and password that is supplied by the user match what is in the database. So in this line, first, if we don't find any user, we return null. The reason I'm returning null instead of throwing an exception is because of the way I want to use this method elsewhere. So I don't want to throw an exception. And then we check whether the password that is coming from the request matches the password of this user. How do we know the user? By the username supplied in the request. So if someone supplies John Doe as the username, we find a user with the username John Doe and compare the supplied password versus the hashed password we saved in database. Hence this bcrypt.compare. Sometimes this can throw an exception, I believe. So that's the reason for this try catch here. And once again, I'm deleting the password before returning that user. And then for this login here, this takes in a payload of any, and what we are doing here is basically to generate a JWT access token and send to the client, to the requester. So this is not really doing any much, because before we call this method, we are already sure that the supplied credentials are valid. So it it is okay like this, as we are going to see. Next, let's look at what is called strategies. A strategy is just an approach for handling authentication and authorization. We are going to start with what is called local strategy, which is what we use for authentication to check the user credentials, whether they are valid or not. So the authentication strategy is going to make use of this guy over here, the validate user. And I want to have this in the Auth module. So I have this strategies folder and I have local.strategy.ts. Before adding the codes here, I'll go ahead and install a library, Passport. This is a popular library for authentication in Node.js, and it's going to help us with the strategies. So I'll copy the command to install this, and that for dev dependency. Install that as well. Back to the file, this is the code I want to have, and it is really straightforward. So over here we just have a constructor that calls super, that is the parent. There is optional configuration if you want to. This is going to assume that for authentication we are going to have a field named username and another field named password, and that corresponds with what we have here, username and password. Or more important is the DTO for login. So during login we are going to supply these two fields. So we have username here and password according to what the local strategy expects. But if, for example, your user has a field named email instead of username, this is how you can configure it when you call this super. And then down here we are making use of the method we defined in Auth service. And what does it do? It just validates the credentials. If we have a user returned, then everything is good. Otherwise, we throw unauthorized exception. So this is calling this method. We have already explained what is going on here. And next, we are going to have a strategy for JWT. Now, the JWT strategy, what it does is to validate the token, the access token. Remember that when we authenticate a user, we issue this access token. Later, we are going to see how to protect the routes so that a valid token must be supplied before the request is allowed. And that's what the JWT strategy is going to do, to validate the access token. Let me create the file JWT strategy.ts. In this file, I'm going to have something really straightforward as well. We're going to fix some imports in a moment. Actually, let's start with fixing the import. So we need another library for JWT. I'm going to install those. Install this, and then the type definitions. This as well. Another one is the config for config module, because we are going to keep some stuff in the .env file, as you can see here. So I need to make use of the config module that Nestjs provides. And for that, let me install this package for config. Therefore means that I need to create a .env file and put my JWT environment variables there. Let's have .env. Here I'll use some super secret. Use something that is secret worthy. And one more thing, I need to import and configure the config module over here. The configuration is straightforward. We import config module To avoid having to import this in every other module that needs it, we say global true. Alright, back to the strategy. Let's see what else is missing. Why do I have... Okay. To help us understand this JWT strategy, what is happening here, let me first of all update the Auth module. In the imports array, in addition to these users, I'm going to import some configurations. This one is from passport library, and the next one is from JWT module. Let me also import fixed import for config module. For the JWT, here we're doing a really intuitive configuration. So we are specifying the JWT secret, and we are specifying the expiration time in minutes, in this case 60 minutes. That means if we issue an access token after 60 minutes, it should be considered expired. Back to the JWT strategy. What happens here is that with the help of the passport library, extracting and validating the JWT is made simple. In the constructor, we pass this argument. With this, the passport library is expecting that there should be a bearer token in the request header, and it is going to extract and validate that token for us. This ignore on expiration is to whether to allow the token if it has expired. So one thing is a valid JWT, another check is has it expired. If it has expired, should I ignore that expiration? If you could recall, we set the expiration in minutes to 60 minutes here. The implication of that is if we say yes, ignore, it means that even if the token has expired, as long as it is a valid JWT that we issued, it is going to pass. So we definitely don't want to allow that, at least for our use case. And then the secret, once again, is the JWT secret we specified in the .env. And then the next method is this validate. There's something I find a little bit confusing here, that this is called validate, but what happens in the real sense is that before this method is called, the JWT token has been checked and deemed valid. What that means is, I've also added a comment here if you clone and you are going through this code. So what happens is that the JWT has been validated, and then this method is called with the decoded payload. Here you can do additional validation and checks according to your requirement. It is not really required. I mean, you can just return like this. That is fine. But to show you an example, I'm trying to check whether the user status is active. If not active, I'm just going to throw an exception. Once again, let me mention that what this JWT strategy does is to validate the access token. Unlike the local strategy that handles authentication, that is to check whether the user credentials are correct. The next thing we are going to look at is guards. I'll come to Auth and create this folder, guards. First we have local auth.guard.ts. This is just a guard that we can apply to route. In this case, we are going to apply this guard to the login route. So the way it works is that the guarded route, in this case the login route, when the request comes in, this local auth guard is going to intercept that request and forward the payload to the local strategy. That's how it works. So this is the guard we apply to guard the authentication, the login route. Now let's have the JWT guard. JWT.guard.ts. The local auth guard is for authentication, whereas the JWT guard is for protecting routes that will require valid JWT token before they are accessed. Once again, the passport library makes this easy for us, so we just need to extend the auth guard JWT imported from passport. Then down here, this is just an extra thing that I think is useful. We can have some route that we want to be public. That means it doesn't require authentication or valid JWT for the user to access that route. So this is useful, as we are going to see when we get to the controllers. So if we have a route that we have marked as public, we just return true here. Otherwise, we let the passport to handle the other validation. This is public should come from a decorator that I'm going to create in a moment, which is the thing we are going to apply to public route. So let me go ahead and create that decorator, public.decorator.ts. And the logic is simple, just a Nestjs decorator. We apply this to the route, and the route should be seen as public. Should go back to the guard, and the import error should go away. Next, let me add another decorator that makes it easy to access the currently logged in user. So instead of trying to access from the request object like request.user all the time, we can just have this decorator that handles that for us. It seems we've implemented all the logic for this application. Let me go ahead and expose some endpoints for us to test. In the user's control, I'm going to delete all these and have only these two endpoints. This one to find the users, this one to find user by profile. This one is going to return the authenticated user, making use of this decorator here, the current user decorator. And this, we are going to use this to demonstrate the password, the select something I explained in this entity file, this guy here. Let me see if we need some other cleaning up to do. And auth controller, we need to update the auth controller. So here I'm going to remove the auto generated and have this. This has only two endpoints, one for login, the other one for register, signing up. And I think we are good. So let me run this application. I'll go over to Postman and let me add a breakpoint before I do that. So to create a user, we have to hash the password. Let's see the hashed password. I'll send the request and it comes over here. You can see the password from Postman just says whatever, but over here after hashing, this is what we get. So we have to hash the password before we store it in the database. I will let this continue. We should get a response. The user is created. And of course, if I check the database, you can see that we have one user there. The username is John Doe, and by default, inactive. And this is the password that is hashed. Let me remove this breakpoint and create another user. Let's say Lucy, and the name is Lucy Wu. Now we should have two users in the database. For the login, let me go ahead and send the request, and this will use the local strategy for authentication. So by the way, the controller for this is going to be the controller to call, And like I mentioned before, this is going to use the local auth guard. Then let me check something. Here in the providers array, we need to import the local strategy and JWT strategy. That is for auth module. Import these two things. I'll send the login request. You can see we got the access token. We are going to see what is inside this token in a moment. The next thing I want to test is to get users. We are going to check whether the password field is included. If you could recall this select here. So I'll send the request and password field is not there. Even though in the implementation, we just say get menu. We did not select specific fields. But you will notice that we're able to make this request without any JWT token. And that's not what we want. We want to protect the routes in our application. How do we do that? To achieve this, I want to apply the JWT guard globally. So in the list of providers here, I'm going to apply the guard like this and import the files. Import auth module. With this, all the routes in our application will require valid JWT, except the route we have marked as public using the public decorator. An example is the login route and sign up route, because it doesn't make sense to require token before sign up. If I remove this public decorator here and try to send the sign up request, you will see that the token will be required. I'll send this request, it says unauthorized. But if I apply the public to tell that this is public, I'll send the request again. We got an error because we are trying to create with the username that already exists. That's the reason for the error. But the request went through. We can put something else here to prove a point. So the global guard works using the JWT auth guard, and we can override, we can specify an endpoint to be public using the public decorator. Back to the find users endpoint, you will notice down that if I send the request, we get 401 unauthorized because we have protected all the routes. What I can do now is copy this JWT and go here and pass that as a bearer token as expected. Before I send the request, let me go to JWT Strategy. I've added this breakpoint so we can see what is inside the decoded payload here. So if I send this request, we get to the breakpoint. We can see that the payload has those fields we supplied when we issued the token. If we go to auth service and we come down here, we have this username and we have this subject, which is the user ID, and these two extra standard JWT fields, issued at and expires at. So this works as expected, the JWT strategy. Let me continue this execution, and if I go back here, we got the expected response because the user account is not active. If you could recall that we added an extra step here, which is optional. Here I am checking to know if the user account is active before I can allow that user. But let me go to the database and update this user so that step can pass. Go to my SQLite database the user in question is John Doe. So I'm going to set the account to active. We'll commit that. Back to the endpoint, I will send this request again. Once again, we are here, but I'm going to remove this breakpoint now. Then continue. If we go back, you can see that we got the list of users. This is the user we are the logged in user, and these are the other users. We can do something similar for find one, but this is to demonstrate the current user decorator that we applied here. Just, where is it? That should be in the users, I think. Users controller. Come on, where are you? In the users controller, we made this helper, this decorator, a convenient way for us to grab the authenticated user. So I'm going to call this /users/profile endpoint. First, it is going to require valid JWT because once again, it is a protected route. Then I'm going to copy this JWT token for John Doe, supply that as a bearer token. I guess that's the same thing that is already applied there. I will send the request. You can see that we get the authenticated user. Okay guys, I believe we have achieved our goal for this lesson. We've learned quite a number of things, including how to hash password before storing in a database, how to validate that password. In this case, we used bcrypt. We have also seen how to issue JWT token, how to validate the token, how to handle authentication using the local strategy, and how to protect route, as well as how to make some routes publicly accessible, among other things. I hope this lesson really makes sense. Until next time, enjoy coding.